And now it is again my great pleasure to give the floor to Yannis Theocharis, who is the book reviews editor of the journal. So if you write a book, read a book, or see a book that you think we should review, please get in touch with him. And Yannis will be chairing our last panel this afternoon, here in Britain at least, titled Digital Media and Political Engagement. After the panel, we will have some informal breakout sessions. Yannis, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Christian, for the introduction. And welcome, everyone, to the panel Digital Media and Political Engagement. It's a topic that seems to be permanently relevant. The last few years, we've seen an increasing number of people using digital media for political participation individually, collectively, and there's lots of new voices that can be heard now in the political arena. And they found diverse means to express themselves and find an audience and mobilize others. And that's more or less what we're going to be hearing today in the papers in the panel. Without further delay, we'd just like to provide some instructions to the presenters. Each paper is allocated a total of 25 minutes for both presentation and discussion. Discussion will follow presentation of each paper. If a presentation runs longer than the recommended 12-15 minutes, there will be less time for discussion of the paper, but other papers in the panel will not be affected. You will get a 12-minute warning from me and a 15-minute warning too. Please keep an eye for those warnings and just wave at me that you've seen them. After that, it's up to you how much longer would you like to go. Before I introduce the presenter, you're reminded that you're invited to post questions and use the chat function of Zoom. The next presentation is by Jennifer Oser from Ben-Gurion University, Shelley Boulianne from MacEwan University, and Amit Levinson, also from Ben-Gurion University. It is entitled Yes, I Can in the Digital Era, a meta-analysis of political efficacy, online participation, and offline participation. Jenny, Shelley, Amit, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. I'm doing a share screen now. Okay, can you all see my presentation as the slide and not my screensaver of the bullfighters?
Yep.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you to the organizers, Yannis, Christian, and the IJPP team. At this stage of the pandemic, I've come to the conclusion that it's still useful to do these Zooms and enjoyable as a presenter, but I'm not so sure how useful and definitely not easy for the organizers. So thank you for your bravery and your investment. And it's great to see some names on all of the screens that we're familiar with. Hope that some of you stayed for the informal networking at the end. As Yannis mentioned, this is collaborative work that I'm presenting on behalf of my collaborators, Shelley Boulianne, who I believe is here with us, Amit Levinson, who is not able to join. Our title, Testing the Collectivism Hypothesis. We have here a meta-analysis of political efficacy, online participation, and offline participation. My goal here with the presentation is to keep the presentation piece on the briefer end. We did upload a paper and we'd be happy to have a lively discussion. So feel free to gather your questions as I'm speaking. I'll be brief about some of the nerdy meta-analysis specifics, but anyone who wants to ask questions, etc., we'd be very happy to expand upon that in the discussion or at other times. So the motivation for this study began in a collaborative piece that Shelley and I worked on and just recently came out at Public Opinion Quarterly that focuses on reinforcement effects between digital media use and political participation. And as we were working on the coding of that study, we noticed something very peculiar, that political efficacy is almost always included as a control variable, but very under-theorized and used in many different ways in the different studies. Which has been the case in offline studies, but even more, it seemed random and under-theorized in the online work that we've been relating to. And so that motivated us to take a closer look at, what have scholars done in terms of investigating this question of political efficacy in the digital age. What I have here on this slide is data from the ANES of the US data, which is sort of considered the gold standard data on efficacy. Going from left to right, we see left is the 1950s, the right is 2016. We see a general decline in this key index that they have about political efficacy over the past 5 or 6 decades. Now we know that part of this period overlaps certainly with the rise of digital media and online participation, online use, et cetera. But there are obviously several other changes that have been happening in recent decades. So we see an importance in taking a look at the online, offline specifically to understand better how it relates to this decline. Here we see in terms of theory and literature, we're focusing on, do citizens perceive that their online political actions make a difference? This term, collectivism, has been coined paying attention to the question of whether it really means anything. Activism, we think of that as something that's meaningful and meaty. Collectivism, maybe it's something that's low effort, low impact. So our main research question here, how does political efficacy relate to online and offline political participation? And I see Yannis's face on the screen as I'm describing this. One of the main reasons why we became motivated to look at this through a meta-analysis is coming to one of Yannis's papers, pointing out that there's very little good over time cross-national data in the standard cross-national studies that can help us get at this at some of the more traditional ways. So the additional questions that we also look at are, how does the relationship between political efficacy and online political activities differ by year, meaning over time, and also by democratic context. By year, we would expect from the literature somewhat of a convergence between online and offline participation over time. If we do see a difference in early years, we would expect them to become more similar over time. And in democratic context, what we focused on is this question of responsiveness. In democratic environments that are measured to be considered to be more responsive to the will of the people, we would expect there to be greater responsiveness also to online political participation, and perhaps even more so. Our hypotheses here spell out what I just described more informally. These are pre-registered hypotheses, and we saw this as an important part of our research design, since with the collectivism hypothesis in general, either way the data proves is an important, as we see it, contribution to the literature. Whether political efficacy is more weakly related to online participation or not, tells us something about its relationship to traditional participation as well. Our data collection, I'm gonna go over this fairly quickly. We use all the standard approaches you would use in meta-analysis. We use key terms, we use citations from a classic study, we use prominent citations, prominent articles, citations list, etc. We've also done outreach to authors for unpublished studies in order to gather the studies that we have coded in our data set. This led to what we have here in this figure. This is the Prisma diagram. Those who haven't seen something like this before, what this leads you through a flow chart of identifying the maximal number of potential studies that you'll include in the meta-analysis. And then the bottom box there is the 50 studies that made it through all of our selection criteria and are currently in our coded database. I want to emphasize here that we uploaded a paper to the Dropbox. We're really happy to receive comments. As we note on the paper, these are preliminary findings. We expect that this N of 50 will change somewhat. It certainly won't double, but it may increase by a few by the time we get to the submitted paper. So data overview, 50 studies, 195 coded coefficients. Data ranges, years here is the year the study was, implemented the survey in the field. So between 2000 and 2016 were when the surveys were implemented, upon which the studies did their analysis. About half of these were in the US, about half outside of the US, which is par for the course for these sorts of data, and almost 50,000 respondents. Moving on to our method, we use two main methods. The first is a vote counting method, which is the prevalence of significant or non-significant effects. And the second method we use is a multi-level random effects analysis. And here we can get at a more precise size estimate. For this estimate, we use the R package metaphor to get at that more precise analysis. So this figure here visually presents the findings of the collectivism hypothesis to the vote counting method. Let me orient you to it. The two bars on the left are offline political participation. And we see that the high bar in black that has 63% of the studies, 63% of the significant studies, and the lower bar in gray shows that 37% of them are non-significant. So for the offline studies, we see that it's more common for them to have a significant relationship. Again, this is between political efficacy and whatever form of participation is in the bars. Moving over to the right-hand bars, this is online political participation. We see it's about 50-50, right? It's a coin toss, essentially, whether there's a significant relationship between political efficacy and online political participation. If you notice here over at the legend, the p-value for this difference is marginally significant. It's 0.076. And those of us who know the importance of not only using a p.05 rough threshold and want to get at more precise estimates, so we're interested to move on to the random effects analysis. So in the random effects estimation, we again see, I'm sort of visually showing the output of the findings, that both online and offline political participation have a positive and significant relationship to political efficacy. And you can see that the coefficient for offline political participation is larger. It's 0.148, for online it's 0.069. Both are positive and significantly different from zero, but with this more controlled comparison, there are no significant differences between the effect size for on-PP and off-PP, meaning this size of these two coefficients is not significantly different from each other. Here is the random effects forest plots for those who like the visual of it. The part circled in the bottom right is again showing that the online and the offline are not significantly different from each other in terms of the size of the positive relation that they both have to political efficacy. So in terms of rounding up the findings for the first hypothesis, we see this collectivism hypothesis is not supported. And as noted when I discussed the registered hypotheses, we see this as an important null finding in terms of online participation being as strongly associated with efficacy as offline participation. And moving on to these other two hypotheses that I mentioned briefly of overtime differences and established democracies, these also are not supported by the findings, meaning over time, there's a consistent relationship of online and offline participation. And we also don't see differences in democracies that are more strongly responsive to their citizenry in comparison to those that are least responsive. So to move to get us toward discussion, we see this as contributing, at least at this stage, to strengthening research agendas about online political participation. They perceive to be efficacious, the importance of continuing to research it, not sort of dismissing it as collectivism. That, again, with this strength of democracy and over time, these findings hold. We also want to note, and we expect this to be important timing for this study, as we expect that in this current COVID era, as we're all here online together, we expect an increase of online activities in general, and to be thoughtful about how, in different contexts, et cetera, online participation can continue and increase in being efficacious. Our next steps, we're completing final study identification and outreach, intercoder reliability, with a few more robustness tests that we're working on. And I'll also note researchers welcome. Both Shelley and I are recruiting research team members for this project on different grants between undergrad and postdoc. So if you or any of your colleagues or any of your students find this of interest, we'd be really happy to hear from you. And revisions in progress. Comments are extremely welcome in general, but especially on two issues that we're still working on. With the democratic context hypothesis, we've used, as I think I wrote it in a slide, but I didn't say it out loud. We've used a fairly simple measure, the VDEM measure, the Varieties of Democracy measure of polyarchy, that in general summarizes democratic quality and responsiveness. And we have not yet sort of broken down to more specific and alternate suggestions for that democratic context, and comments and suggestions on that are welcome, both theoretically and empirically. And we are working on a technical question. If there are any meta-analysis or R nerds here who want to talk about it, we're very happy to do that. For the random effects analysis in our using metaphor, our N on that is relatively low. Not all of our studies can be included because we still have to specify how to include standardized effects that for which studies don't report on standard errors. So we have a few queries out there to stats knowledgeable colleagues that we're still working to advance. But if anyone here has comments on that, they're also welcome. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for this presentation. I'm going to get straight into the questions. I can already see two over there. The first one comes from Eugenia. How many non-responsive democracies, non-democracies were included in the sample? US seems to be overrepresented.
Yeah. The VDEM measure is a, this polyarchy measure is a continuous measure. So it's not dichotomously coded into responsive and non-responsive. I don't have those numbers right here in front of me. I don't want to misquote them, but they are in the paper that's in our Dropbox. So if you want to take a look in there, and I'd be happy to discuss the specifics more afterward. The US is certainly overrepresented, but I will say one robustness test that we've already completed is comparing the US to non-US samples. And we have, that shows no significant difference between the US and non-US samples. An additional robustness test on our agenda for this week is 8 of our 50 studies are with a sample from China. And so that's another robustness test. If we take those 8 studies and separate out from the others, do we see a difference there? So those sorts of democratic context questions, we have some more work to do. And I also see that my valued colleague Shelley has opened up her video screen. So I also really want to welcome people to address their questions to her, as this has been a very collaborative project.
Okay. Follow-up note by Eugenia is that VDEM includes alternative indices such as deliberative democracy, which might be useful.
Yeah.
That's probably something to take on board.
Mm-hmm.
Next, we have a question by Charles, who asks whether you distinguish between collectivism and what I think used to be called the cute cat theory. So that's, I'm guessing this is going into the direction of sort of weak versions of activism and completely expressive activism. I guess maybe Charles could elaborate a little bit more. You want to take up this question, Jenny, or just?
If the person is here, if they could say it out loud, because I'm not sure that I understand the question. I haven't heard the term cute cat theory before, so I appreciate you bringing that to my attention.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
It might be someone like Clay Shirky.
Okay.
An article in Foreign Affairs during the Arab Spring. Wrote an article in which he talks about the cute cat theory, which is just the effort to attract followers or attract a great number of clicks, where there's no commitment beyond that.
Right.
So if you show a cute cat on your Facebook, everyone likes it.
Right. Yeah. I hear the question. I think in terms of how our data and research design relate to that, I do want to note that our findings are somewhat of a surprise to me and to us. We certainly did expect there to be a collectivism effect where there would be a lower sense of efficacy for those who are engaged in different sorts of online participation. We don't have the resolution with this sort of a meta-analysis, right? For that sort of a cute cat, that would probably be better with some sort of an experimental design or something that would be a survey that would include indicators that are a bit more specifically tailored. Part of what we're limited to in a meta-analysis is studies that have accumulated over time with enough similar measures and studies that we can sort of summarize something about the field. And so what we have here at this point is this clear sort of summary about the field that, at least from the studies as they stand today and our analyses as they stand today, something that wouldn't support QtCat in terms of online participation across the board, right? We don't see that online participation is across the board something that is an activity that less efficacious people engage in, or that people relate to as being something that makes less of a difference in the world. Shelley, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so this project is kind of a puzzle piece, and there's two other projects that are related to it, but one of them is to look at all of the studies that have been done on online political participation. And so mere clicks or likes, that doesn't tend to be included in scales of the existing research, so it's a systematic review. It tends to be things like signing petitions and political expression on social media, those types of activities. So these really, really low effort activities aren't often included in those scales or indexes of political participation. And also, I noticed that Eric had a question a while back while you were talking about the inclusion criteria. So just to clarify that we have another study that is a systematic review on all studies that have looked at political efficacy and digital media and their relationship to each other. So not just online political participation, such as signing petitions, but basically any kind of measure of digital media. So your work, Eric, would have been included in that other one. We have 167 studies on that one. So just a note of clarification on inclusion. It had to include a measure of offline participation and online participation, and the role of political efficacy on both of those to be included in this subset of 50.
Right. And I'll clarify a technical piece I didn't add in. The shift from the bar chart, where we're looking at just thresholds of a significance, to the random effects analysis. Part of that is a more precise analysis in general, but part of the precision is we're including two effects from each of our studies. For a study to qualify for our meta-analysis, it has to be a survey that includes political efficacy and also two different dependent variables that we're paying attention to: online participation and offline participation. And so what that means is that these effects are nested, and we have to be able to control for them the same way you would in any sort of a multi-level study. And so that's what the random effects multi-level does, in addition to allowing us to get an effect size estimate.
Okay, we've got two questions. One is, I guess the one the point by Eric was already tackled by Shelley to some extent. I have a point by Johannes, wondering if you could speculate about the reasons why political efficacy is descriptively less strongly related to online political participation than offline political participation, and whether that could be a measurement issue.
Mm-hmm.
That online political participation is measured less well in these studies than offline political participation.
Yeah, but it's certainly a possibility, and that's part of the, as we're now sort of deepening our writing in the discussion section, we're also interested and puzzled by that finding, and that's one of the topics that we've been focusing on. We see that, and with offline participation over time, there's been several decades to get it, fairly consistent measures across different studies. And for the online studies, there are more diverse measures, and those measures also change more quickly over time. So we do, as the studies continue and multiply, right now we have a good solid number of studies that fit our criteria. We could see additional future meta-analyses that would more strictly limit the indicators of online and offline participation, and could perhaps tackle that question at a more granular level.
Jenny, how many studies you included, from those you included, differentiate between internal and external efficacy? Christian is asking, and it would be possible to differentiate between them in your studies. And are there any difference between cross-sectional versus panel longitudinal data designs, asks Michael.
Great. Excellent questions. We want all of you to join our research team and to send your students and your colleagues to join our research team. For Christiane, your question, we measured, for a study to qualify for our meta-analysis, it only had to have any measure of efficacy. It could have had only general, it could have had only internal, it could have had only collective, etc. We coded any measure of efficacy that they did include. I don't remember all of the numbers off the top of my head. Christian, I'll be happy to get them to you. Most of them include more than one, as I remember, but certainly not all. We did finish doing robustness tests to check whether the results are affected by looking at only internal and only external efficacy, and there are no differences in our results to this point with the data that we have, whether between online and offline participation when you use different kinds of efficacy measures. The one difference we do see, which is consistent with the literature over time, is that there's a stronger connection between internal efficacy and participation, whether it's online or offline. So again, here's another dimension on which online participation is not this collectivist exceptional measure. It has the same patterns in relation to the different types of efficacy that offline participation does. And the next question, yes, of our 50 studies, 6 of them include longitudinal designs. And as Shelley and I found in the POQ paper that just came out, those are fairly recent and they seem to be sort of being fruitful and multiplying. We expect to see more and more panel studies over time where that can be investigated more carefully. With only 6 of our 50, they also don't operationalize the direction in which they consistently in which they do their analyses. So the state of the literature isn't currently ready to support that sort of analysis. But my guess is even within 5 years, it would be. Country-specific studies are certainly supporting the increase of that literature. Shelley, would you add anything to that? I know you've been looking at this recently. Okay.
No, again, this is a subset. We have Jenny and I have a larger project where we look at the digital media measures in general. So we have some of the answers to those questions, but there's still that, what you're saying is still consistent for that larger body of 160 some studies. There's few longitudinal studies, and we didn't find very large differences between internal and external, and the difference we found favors the internal efficacy having a larger effect than external efficacy on digital media.
Okay, before we close, we just have less than 1 minute left. Shahir is asking if someone can help her get access to this paper. The Dropbox file, does not seem to work. Perhaps you can provide the link, Jenny, Shelley.
Sure,
Let me, just before we move to the next paper, which is about platforms, I just wanted to leave there a comment of my own, and perhaps we can discuss it at a later point. Whether the data is enough to allow you to look at differences between platforms when it comes to online participation. Yeah, I would guess it's not, but my guess is that as Web 2.0 emerges, people can be, can express themselves more, and perhaps that I don't know, perhaps you can observe something there. I just wanted to leave it there, but okay, the data is not available. It's not available. Let's move to the next paper, which is called Platform Matters. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jenny and Shelley and Amit, for the exciting presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And we had a few people ask about privately about opportunities for joining. I'm going to put a link in the chat also about call for applicants and also for a paper. I'll cheat and I'll give you, we've updated the paper a bit since we submitted September 11th. So I'll put a link into today's version of the paper for anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Brilliant. Please do work with Jenny and Shelley. They are excellent collaborators. I can testify to that. Yes, the next paper is Platform Matters, Political Expression, Social Media. It's by Eugenia Mitchelstein of the University. Pablo Boczkowski from the Northwestern University and Camila Giuliano, also from the University of San Andrés. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Yannis. Thank you, everyone, for being there. Thank you to the previous presenters. Their papers were very interesting, and I was thinking the same thing as Yannis asked. Is this different by platform? And this is what we set out to investigate with Pablo Boczkowski and Camila Giuliano. This is, as Jenny said earlier, a collaborative work, and I'm presenting, but I'm presenting on their behalf. So this is a work we conducted, the three of us together. So I'll let you know what we're gonna do in this very short presentation. I'll keep it short because I'm really looking forward to comments and questions. So we wanna show why political expression matters and who engages in political talk on which social media. So we have hypotheses and research questions. We base our research on a face-to-face survey and 158 in-depth interviews. So we can use these mixed methods designed to show why some platforms are more conducive to political talk and political expression than others. We find in the findings that not all social media platforms are created equal, and that Twitter is an outlier, and this matters because a lot of researchers and professors are on Twitter, and they tend to assume that what they see on Twitter is replicated on other platforms, and we find that that's not the case in our interviews and our survey. And this, of course, has implications for research on political expression in polarized contexts. So, as we all know, informal political talk is a fundamental component of democracy. And we also know from literature that men, older and more educated people are more likely to engage in political discussion. It is difficult to discuss politics in polarized contexts, as work by Matz and Kramer-Walsh and many others has found, because people are uncomfortable, they don't want to fight, they avoid politics, they avoid talking about politics. But some researchers have said that social media might provide citizens with opportunities to express themselves, share their ideas. Stromer-Galley says that anonymity or perceived anonymity may bring less exposure and risk, and our colleagues from Argentina have found that polarization may exclude some people, or people might self-exclude because they are fearful of polarization on social media. But scholarship on political expression on social media has, for the most part, failed to differentiate across platforms. They just ask, do you talk about politics on social media? We have some hypotheses and research questions. We find that older people are more likely to post personal opinion of politics, economics, and current affairs. Men are more likely. People with higher levels of education and people of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to post their personal opinions about politics, economics, and current affairs. We wanted to see if there were differences in the frequency of political expression on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and WhatsApp users. How do users make sense of varying opinion expression practices on social media platforms? And how do users engage in political expression practices? So how do they perceive the platforms they are in and they participate in, and how they adapt their behavior consequentially to their perceptions, which is not the same question. So we conducted a face-to-face survey in the greater Buenos Aires area. That represents more or less 40% of the population in Argentina. The dependent variable was the frequency with which respondents posted personal opinions of politics, economics, and current affairs. The independent variables were frequency of use of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, gender, age, education, socioeconomic status, and whether users shared media posts on their profiles. And then we had semi-structured interviews conducted in Argentina, not just the greater Buenos Aires area. And we examined in these interviews the instances in which interviewees talked about their perceptions, practices, and interpretations of political expression on social media. So we found, although younger people appeared to post, not younger, but maybe 30 to 44, appeared to post more personal opinions on social media at least once a day. There were no significant statistical differences across age groups. There were no significant differences between men and women. And there were no significant differences according to educational attainment and socioeconomic status. This was all a surprise to us. These were our hypotheses. We expected to find differences and we didn't. But we did find that Twitter users are more likely to post personal opinions on social media. So the coefficients are not significant for age, gender, socioeconomic status, educational attainment, but they are for Twitter frequency of use. So frequent Twitter users are more likely to post their personal opinions on social media. This might not be a surprise for people who are on Twitter, as some of us are. I can tell by the shared IJPP hashtag 2020. So why does this happen? Well, Twitter is perceived as a space for public expression and sometimes aggressive discussion, as these are quotes from the interviews. Twitter, I use it more to read the news because Twitter is used more for that. They don't post so much of their private life and their personal stories. It is more practical to share what other users write. Twitter is the most politicized space I have in my life. But this can also be perceived as negatively. Twitter seems to me the devil because of the 140 character format. It serves to vomit any thoughts that you have. On Facebook, interviewees are careful when expressing political expressions because they have friends, family, teachers, classmates. It's very broad. You have to take care of what you publish. I try to not have a strong political profile on Facebook because political exchanges in our society are not often conducted in the best way. When they see exchanges between other people, they feel uncomfortable. They say they are friends and they fight like this. I don't like it. I don't publish just anything on Facebook. I assess whether it is convenient to. I know that it is a way of exposing myself. So this didn't come up on Twitter at all. People didn't feel exposed on Twitter. It might have to do with the way profiles are built on Facebook. It's your photo, it's your name, and that's not always the case on Twitter. On WhatsApp, interviews talk mostly about personal topics with people they know personally. They use it to organize work. They use it with friends. Sometimes they comment the news, but only with friends. Some of them don't like discussing politics or WhatsApp. I don't like it because it's like the goal is to have the best reply, to be their person. If I were face-to-face with that person, I could interpret the body language and prevent them from saying something outrageous. I don't want to receive political message on WhatsApp. The phone seems more intimate. So they discuss sometimes issues with people they know, but they feel it's an intimate space, and that's not at all the perception about Twitter. Instagram is seen as an aestheticized and depoliticized platform. Instagram is something more completely empty. You post photos and nothing else. On Instagram, everything looks nice, everything seems cool, like one has a perfect life. Instagram is not so politicized. It is more personal and not just anyone joins. You can control it a little bit more. So they care more for what they show on Instagram, but they rarely discuss politics there. So we built with Pablo and Camila a matrix in which on one side we have the amount of anonymity and exposure respondents feel, and on the other we have whether it's about public life and private life. And Twitter is perceived to be more anonymous and devoted to the discussion of public life. Facebook is less anonymous. People feel exposed or more exposed, but they also sometimes discuss public issues there, but they are very careful about it because they know they can be identified and that people they know from other contexts might see it. Instagram is devoted mostly to private life or non-public life, like travel and food and fashion, but not politics. And people feel somewhat exposed there, but not as much as on Facebook. And on WhatsApp, people feel very exposed. They mostly discuss issues with other people they know. They have group friends groups and work groups and family groups, but it's mostly devoted to public private life, and politics and current affairs seems out of place to some of the interviewees. So interviews' perceptions and practice of political expression on social media vary as a function of each platform's culture, imagined audiences, and degree of exposure to other users. Not all platforms are created equal or equally polarized. Political conversation on social media is shaped both by the wider political context and platform socio-technical affordances and culture. Users employ different strategies to talk about politics based on their social media repertoires and relational factors within the platforms. We have looked into context collapse, and we see that given a perceived high level of exposure on Facebook, users try to be more careful on that platform, while on Twitter, they express their opinions politics without major concerns related to their reputation. This research has implications for research on polarization and public-private boundaries, and also on political talk. And it also shows the value of using both quantitative research and qualitative research, because we saw the differences across platforms on our quantitative research, but it was the in-depth interviews that allowed us to probe on why these differences were happening and how these respondents perceived the different platforms. So I kept it short, and I can see we already have some questions. I'd like to thank all of you. And of course, the paper is already uploaded on the Dropbox folder. And thanks to Pablo and Camila, who I can see are with us now and who worked on this paper.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. This is a very, very exciting and interesting paper, and I think the work that you do with this is a field dominated with quantitative studies, and you're one of the few research teams that actually work so beautifully with qualitative methods, adding context to things that usually is represented to us purely by numbers. So I really, really, really like this work. Christian has a question to start with. He was wondering if there's anything in your data that speaks to differences between users of these platforms via computers versus mobile devices. Is that correct, Christian? Did I read it correctly?
Yes. I'm just interested in, the extent to which, everyone now uses mobile and that distinction doesn't even matter anymore, or was there something in the data that allows to, draw some distinctions between people who mainly use some of these platforms, at least, from a computer, perhaps when they're working, or, for example, WhatsApp obviously is mostly mobile only. So I was interested in that differentiation, if it's relevant at all.
That's an excellent question. We could actually control for youth predominantly, or because we did ask people in the survey, which was conducted in 2016. So it's already 4 years ago, and maybe with sense there might be some difference between computer and cell phone. And we asked how they access primarily the internet. We didn't ask them whether they commented on politics or not, but there was a question over what was their primary way of access of going online. So we could control for that before actually sending it to a journal in our next regression. So thank you. That's a very good question, but I don't have an answer for it yet. We will.
Okay, there's a question by Shelley. Are there ideological differences in who posts on different platforms in the qualitative data or in the quantitative data?
I don't know if Camila wants to say something. Did we look at ideological difference? We didn't, right? Cami? We didn't. I think the survey might allow us to look at that, because we did have some questions about ideological leanings, but we didn't include that in the sample. It would be interesting to look into it, and there might be some differences between Facebook and Twitter, but I think they will show in the survey. But it's interesting that in the interviews, we of course knew what was the political leanings of each interviewee, because we asked them about them, and in the in-depth interviews that didn't appear at all. It wasn't that people were more in the 158 interviews, it wasn't that people who were like, I don't know, Kirchnerist, which is like the party in rule now, but it wasn't then it was Macrism, or people who were like Macrists posted more on Twitter or more on Facebook. So that didn't show up in the interviews, and I'm sure about that. We might look if it showed up in the survey. Thank you, it's a good question.
Did you come across WhatsApp groups that are political in nature, and how would this affect the outcomes of your study, asks John.
Yes, we didn't ask particularly about WhatsApp groups that were political in nature in our survey, but they didn't show up in the interviews either. I know they were very popular in Brazil during the election, and they became popular in Argentina during the 2019 election, but that people used it doesn't mean that some people use them, doesn't mean that they were like engaging by most part of the population, but because what we do know because of other research we conducted on WhatsApp, and one of those papers is actually in print. I encourage you to read it. It's by Mora Matassi, Out Domesticating WhatsApp. Mora Matassi, Pablo Boczkowski, I'm the third author, is that people use mostly WhatsApp for personal matters in Argentina, like organizing their personal lives, their work lives, their kids' lives, their family life. So there weren't many political groups in 2016. Some more appear in 2019 as a political strategy, particularly by one of the parties. But it wasn't the main use for most people.
Okay, Eric is asking, in terms of platform perceptions, were there many comments about the trend of almost any political discussion turning polarized and nasty? Were people saddened by that? Did they even notice it? And is this something that would apply more to some platforms and not to others, like Twitter and Facebook?
Yeah, yes, there was a lot of perception that of polarization. Argentina is quite polarized right now, and it was polarized in 2016. So there was perception of polarization, particularly on Facebook and Twitter. But on Twitter, it was sometimes perceived as fun, like I could talk to people who are different from what I think, and that was expected. But because on Facebook, people have friends from work and from their family, and everybody knows who they are, people are careful and they tend to feel uncomfortable about it. So there was perception of polarization and of discussions turned nasty. In the presentation I shared, there just one person actually said that she felt bad because people were discussing, they were friends, they were family, and they were discussing because somebody was for Macri and somebody was for Kirchner or something like that. But it's not people didn't feel the same way about it on Facebook and Twitter. So polarization plays out differently in these two. And this might be, and we didn't ask for this in the survey, this might also be because people who choose to be on Twitter, who are a minority of the population, and that's important to bear in mind, might be different and more politicized than people who choose to be on Facebook. So Facebook is used by a larger proportion of the population, whereas people who actually join Twitter actively, they might have other perceptions of political discussion, of politics in general. And that also might be a reason.
Okay, question by Sebastian. If WhatsApp is mostly used for private affairs, does that mean it's less consequential for political engagement than other platforms? Because I think that discussion with so-called strong ties are more frequent on WhatsApp, and strong ties are key for engagement.
I think that's an excellent question, and we didn't ask about like political activism, so we can't say anything about political engagement. We just know what people chose to talk about. It might very well be because it's not that people didn't all our respondents didn't refrain from discussing politics or news on WhatsApp. Some of them actually did do it, and they felt more comfortable there because they knew it was people they knew, and it was a closed space. So it might very well be that even if it's less frequent, it's more consequential for political action.
All right. Nikki was wondering whether there is any insight into how this informal talks affected the political knowledge acquisition or any future action taken, like online or offline participation. We also have a question from Zainab. Did you find a connection between the frequency of posting and political activism of those surveyed?
We can look into this in the survey. We can say that from the interviews, most of the people weren't like political activists, or most of the people didn't actually engage in politics. So that's from the interviews. In Argentina, voting is compulsory, so of course they all voted. But in the interviews, nothing about, because I discussed politics, then I went to this rally, nothing showed up. And we can look into it in the survey. Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions? I do not see any further question in the chat.
But
Again,
if anybody has a particular comment or has read the paper and wants to comment something about the paper, it's most welcome, because Pablo, Camila, and I are still working on it to submit it to a journal. So any comments or criticism would be more than welcome at this stage.
all right. Thank you very much, Eugenia, Pablo, and Camila, for this very interesting paper. Christian, I think we're very, very much on time for this panel. I don't know how the others went, but here presenters were excellent with keeping on time.
As usual, as long as someone other than me was chairing, we were perfect on timing. I think I did it right. I wanted to thank Yannis and all the presenters for providing another excellent panel.